Imagine for a moment that you are surviving the absolute most dangerous situations on Earth.
Right.
You're crossing the deadly, scorching expanse of the Sahara. And the sheer ambient temperature and lack of water out there, well, they're enough to trigger renal failure in a matter of hours.
Just unimaginably brutal conditions.
Exactly. And then you evade these ruthless human trafficking networks in the Sinai who, they view you not as a human being, but basically as a biological commodity.
Yeah, something to be held for ransom or horrifically stripped for organs.
Right. And then you navigate these treacherous, unpredictable currents in the Mediterranean Sea. You're packed into the hull of a vessel that, it was never engineered to carry human weight.
And this goes on for months, sometimes years.
Years. Your entire nervous system is just flooded with adrenaline and cortisol. You are running on this singular, burning biological imperative to survive.
Just pure survival mode.
Yeah. And then against all mathematical odds, you make it. You reach a place of absolute physical safety.
A host country in Western Europe or North America, maybe.
Exactly. You were given an apartment with a locking door, there's running water, there are no bombs falling, and those traffickers are, thousands of miles away.
You'd think that's the happy ending, right? But here is the profound, devastating paradox we are exploring today. For a shocking number of these survivors, the moment they cross the threshold of that locking door, the moment they achieve absolute physical safety, is the exact moment they succumb to despair.
Yeah, it's a terrifying spike in violence against themselves or against their loved ones.
Right. Why does the phase of the journey that we universally call safety sometimes become, the most lethal phase of all?
It forces a complete reevaluation of human resilience because we operate on this deeply ingrained, almost instinctual assumption that physical safety is a direct proxy for psychological safety.
We just assume it's a 1-to-1 ratio.
Right. We assume that once a body is removed from the line of fire, the brain's alarm system just naturally powers down and the healing process, organically initiates itself.
Like flipping a switch. Exactly. But the reality we are looking at today completely shatters that assumption. It reveals that survival isn't a finish line. For a nervous system that has been fundamentally rewired by prolonged trauma, arriving in a safe environment is often just the beginning of a much more insidious, invisible crisis.
Wow. Well, welcome to today's deep dive. We are taking a rigorous look at a phenomenon that challenges the core tenets of how we understand trauma, migration, and really the entire architecture of the human mind.
It's a huge topic.
It is. And guiding our exploration today is a fascinating stack of source material. It's anchored by a really comprehensive paper titled The Shattered Cage: Anomie, Trauma, and the Crisis of the Eritrean Diaspora, authored by Dr. Gebre.
Really groundbreaking work.
Yeah, and alongside the paper, we're analyzing a slide deck that visualizes the risk factors and strategic interventions, plus a brief but incredibly poignant video excerpts documenting the endurance of this specific community.
So our overarching mission here is to reverse engineer this crisis.
Right.
We are going to examine what happens to the human psyche when a society's foundational rules, those invisible guardrails of daily life, just entirely collapse.
The things we take for granted.
Exactly. We will look at the dark biology of survival, specifically how extreme trauma artificially suppresses the fear of death. And finally, we'll explore a proposed intervention that sounds, honestly, almost too simple to be true.
Yeah, it really does at first glance.
But it's rooted in rigorous evolutionary biology and ancient philosophy. It's the concept of kindness as a structural medical cure.
Now, before we dig into the mechanisms of this crisis, there is a crucial piece of context we need to establish for you listening. The source material we're working from heavily discusses the geopolitical realities in Eritrea.
Yes, it does.
The author directly attributes the societal breakdown and the resulting mass exodus of the youth to the dictatorial regime of Isaias Afwerki, which has been in power for the last 3 decades.
That's the baseline of the paper.
Right. But we need to be explicitly clear on our role here. In this deep dive, we are impartially reporting on the contents of the author's work. Our focus is entirely on understanding the psychological and sociological frameworks the author is presenting.
We are not taking a political side.
Exactly. We are not endorsing specific geopolitical viewpoints or foreign policy positions. Our sole objective is to convey the facts, arguments, and theories precisely as they are laid out in the original source material.
And that distinction is really vital. We are using the author's geopolitical premise strictly as the starting point to analyze a sociological phenomenon. We're just looking at human behavior under extreme, prolonged duress.
So to understand why a society breaks down, we have to understand how it was built in the first place, right? The baseline.
Where did they start?
Before this mass exodus, traditional Eritrean society operated under what the author terms a cage of norms. Now, to a modern, highly individualized Western ear, the word cage immediately sounds, I don't know, oppressive. It sounds like a trap.
Yeah, it's definitely a linguistic hurdle, but in the context of sociology, this cage was a deeply protective, highly structured ecosystem.
Okay.
It wasn't designed to trap the individual, it was designed to create total predictability.
So less like a cage at a zoo and more like an immune system or maybe a magnetic field. It's an invisible force that keeps everyone's internal compass pointing north. It creates a regulated environment where you instantly know the rules of engagement.
Magnetic field is a much better way to conceptualize it, actually. In this traditional framework, familial bonds were the absolute center of gravity.
The family was everything.
Everything. The family was the primary unit of social regulation and dispute resolution. And because of this incredibly tight-knit social integration, extreme forms of violence, things like homicide, and particularly suicide, they were statistical anomalies.
Wow, really?
Virtually unheard of.
Yeah.
The community regulated your behavior, yes, but it also provided an unshakable safety net. You knew your obligations to your family, and you knew unequivocally that your family would catch you if you fell.
Which brings us to the disruption of that magnetic field. The author argues that over the last 30 years, this protective system has been systematically dismantled. But, I mean, a state can't just pass a law outlawing culture.
Right, you can't just legislate away.
So how do you actually dismantle the fundamental norms of a society?
You do it by usurping the role of the parent.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the primary mechanism the author details is the state's institution of forced conscription of school-age children and indefinite national service.
Indefinite.
Indefinite. When the state mandates that adolescents be taken away for summer service and subsequently pulls them into military and labor training with absolutely no definitive end date, you sever the continuity of family life.
You break the chain.
Exactly. The family loses its structural authority.
Wait, I want to make sure I'm grasping the scale of this. If the family is the primary regulatory unit, the source of that magnetic field, and the state physically removes the children, the family isn't just weakened, it becomes entirely impotent. Parents can no longer pass down traditional values, enforce boundaries, or provide predictability because they literally aren't there.
They're gone. And the parental authority is replaced by state authority. But here's the key. The state does not offer the unconditional support of a parent.
Right.
It offers servitude. And this introduces a critical sociological state known as anomie.
Anomie.
Yeah. The author relies heavily on the work of the 19th century sociologist Emil Durkheim to explain this.
Now, I know Durkheim is basically the godfather of sociology, specifically for his work on suicide, right?
He is.
But how does a 19th century French sociologist's theory apply to modern East Africa?
Because the underlying human psychology is identical. Durkheim posited that human desires are essentially limitless. We always want more or different or better.
Sure.
Society's function is to act as a regulatory force. It creates a scale of what is acceptable, expected, and meaningful. It caps our desires and gives us a defined role.
Okay, let's unpack this. It sounds like a society's norms are the scaffolding of a building.
I like that.
When you systematically remove the scaffolding, the people inside don't just find a new way to stand. They experience a terrifying free fall of normlessness.
That's exactly it. When a society undergoes massive, sudden upheaval, whether that's the rapid industrialization Durkheim was observing in Europe or the imposition of indefinite military service in Eritrea, that regulatory scale is shattered.
The guardrails just disappear.
Yes. But the real tragedy, the core of Anomie, is that a new functional scale cannot be immediately improvised. You don't just invent a healthy, coherent moral framework out of thin air.
You can't just write new rules on a whiteboard.
Right. So the traditional magnetic field was destroyed, but it was replaced by a system of arbitrary cruelty and unpredictability. Sociologists call this deregulation or normlessness.
I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of a teenager growing up in that environment. If you've never known the guardrails, if you've grown up entirely within this state of normlessness, what does that actually do to your internal compass?
It dissolves the boundaries regarding the sanctity of life itself.
Oh, man.
Yeah. If you are raised in a system where the state treats human life as highly disposable and your family is powerless to protect you from that system, the inherent value of life becomes heavily devalued in your own mind.
You internalize the state's view of you.
Precisely. The natural consequence of this systemic deregulation is a massive, desperate exodus. The youth flee because there is no predictable future.
So when the scaffolding falls, people run.
They have to.
But here is the devastating pivot in the source material. The escape route they are forced to take isn't just a physical journey. It introduces a new, terrifying psychological mutation. It acts as a sinister training ground.
And the logistics of the journey are harrowing enough on their own.
Well,
We're talking about navigating the deep waters of the Mediterranean, crossing the Sahara.
but it's not just the elements, right? It's the human predators. We're talking severe refugee camp conditions, exposure to brutal human trafficking networks, captors demanding exorbitant ransoms through literal torture.
Yes. And the paper takes these horrors and applies a very specific psychological framework to them. Thomas Joiner's interpersonal theory of suicide.
Interpersonal theory of suicide.
Right. And if we look at this theory, it flips our standard view of self-harm entirely on its head.
Because humans are biologically hardwired to fear pain and death. I mean, our brains will hijack our bodies to keep us alive.
Absolutely. The survival instinct is our strongest drive.
So Joyner argues that to actually take your own life, you have to overcome millions of years of evolutionary programming. You have to develop what he calls the acquired capability for suicide.
You've hit the nail on the head. You are not born with the ability to easily inflict lethal harm on yourself. It has to be acquired.
And how do you acquire it?
Through repeated severe exposure to pain, violence, and trauma.
So it's essentially involuntary exposure therapy to death.
That is a chillingly accurate way to phrase it. When your nervous system is repeatedly subjected to extreme physical pain, or the constant imminent threat of death, the brain eventually has to adapt.
It has to numb itself.
Exactly. It desensitizes the amygdala as a coping mechanism. If you are constantly terrified, your body will literally burn out. So your brain artificially lowers your fear response. The migration journey acts as a factory for producing this capability.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We normally think of trauma as something that makes you fragile.
Right, we treat trauma victims as delicate.
Exactly. But Joiner's theory suggests this specific trauma acts like a gruesome callus. It actually fortifies you against the fear of death, which makes you infinitely more dangerous to yourself.
It's a dark fortification. You survive the Mediterranean crossing, you survive the beatings in the Sinai, and your threshold for pain becomes dangerously high. Your fear of death is artificially suppressed because you have essentially been living in the shadow of it for years.
There's a really striking visual in the slide deck we received that captures this dissonance perfectly.
The desert one.
Yeah, it's a photograph of a seemingly peaceful desert sunset. The sand dunes look pristine, almost like a luxury travel brochure.
It looks serene.
But the text aggressively contrasts this by explicitly identifying the Sahara and Sinai crossings as sites of unimaginable torture and organ harvesting. The vast, indifferent beauty of the landscape is literally the training ground where this acquired capability is forged.
And it forces us to ask this critical question: what happens when a human being whose internal compass was destroyed by state enemy and whose biological fear of death was stripped away by the desert? What happens when they finally reach the supposed finish line?
Which brings us to the lethal convergence. The moment they unlock the door to that apartment in the West, this is the paradox we started with. The violence doesn't end, it turns inward, or against intimate partners. But why? If they're safe, why the sudden spike?
Because that acquired capability, that lack of fear regarding death, is essentially a loaded weapon.
Okay.
But having a loaded weapon doesn't mean it goes off automatically.
Yeah.
According to Joiner's framework, it requires two specific environmental triggers converging with that capability to pull the trigger.
And what are those two factors?
Thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness.
Let's pull those apart. Let's start with thwarted belongingness. I assume this means extreme isolation.
Yes, profound isolation.
But wait, these young people survive the journey by relying on a collective, right? You don't cross a desert or pay off a smuggler entirely on your own. You travel in groups. So why are they suddenly isolated the second they get to the West?
Because the moment they are processed in a host country, they face immediate systemic atomization.
Atomization, like being broken apart.
Exactly. They are often placed in individual housing units, geographically scattered across unfamiliar cities. They are suddenly hit with a barrage of new traumas, overt racism, profound cultural alienation, and impenetrable language barriers.
But surely they can tap into the existing diaspora. I mean, there are established Eritrean communities in these Western cities.
You would think so. But the source material points out a tragic complication: political fragmentation. The political divides regarding the regime back home are so deep and toxic that new arrivals often feel intensely alienated even from their own established diaspora. This brings in John Berry's psychological concept of marginalization.
How does marginalization differ from just, well, not fitting in?
Berry mapped out different paths of acculturation when a person migrates. You can assimilate, where you adopt the new culture entirely. You can separate, where you stick only to your original culture.
Okay.
Marginalization is the absolute most stressful path.
Yeah.
It occurs when an individual loses all contact with their origin culture, which these youths did because the traditional norms collapsed and they fled.
Right.
But they also fail to participate in or be accepted by the new host culture.
So they belong to neither.
Exactly.
They are completely unmoored. It's the psychological equivalent of floating in deep space.
And that void is incredibly dangerous for a social primate. Belonging nowhere is thwarted belongingness in its purest, most toxic form.
Okay, so we have the acquired capability for violence, the loaded gun, and we have total isolation. What is the final catalyst?
Perceived burdensomeness. And this is arguably the most heartbreaking element of the crisis because it stems directly from the love and obligation they feel toward their families.
We're talking about the financial debt of the journey, aren't we?
Massive, crushing financial debt. To finance this escape, to pay the smugglers, or to pay the ransoms demanded by torturers in the Sinai, families back home usually liquidate everything.
Everything.
They sell their land, they incur massive loans. The stakes are unimaginably high.
So the unspoken, or perhaps entirely spoken expectation is that once this young person reaches Europe or Canada, they will immediately get a job, pay back the debt, and become the financial savior of the family.
But the reality of Western economics hits them like a freight train. The families back in the Horn of Africa often have a complete informational blind spot regarding the West.
They just see movies or social media.
Right. They don't understand the exorbitant cost of rent, food, and basic survival. They don't grasp the bureaucratic nightmares of securing a work permit, or how nearly impossible it is to enter a competitive labor market when you don't speak the language and are suffering from complex PTSD.
They just see the relative who made it to the quote-unquote promised land and assume the money should be flowing.
Exactly. The demands for immediate remittances continue unabated. So this young person is sitting in an isolated apartment, completely unable to find work, or working a grueling under-the-table job where the income barely covers their own heating bill.
They're drowning.
And they cannot meet the demands.
You know, asking on behalf of the listener, why would someone who fought so hard to live suddenly think their life is worthless? I mean, they survived the impossible.
Because they can't send the money, they internalize this situation not as an economic reality, but as a profound moral failure. They look at the sacrifices their family made, they look at their own empty bank account, and they internalize the label of being a burden.
It shifts from, I am trying my best, to, I have bankrupted the people I love for nothing.
Yes. And this leads to the fatal internal math Joyner talks about. They adopt the genuinely held, but entirely false belief that my death will be worth more to others than my life.
Wow. It is a perfect lethal storm. The journey stripped their fear of death, the host country stripped their community, and the debt stripped their self-worth.
It all converges.
But I have to push back on one element of this. If they are thousands of miles away, across oceans and continents, why is the pressure from home so immediate and crushing?
You mean, why don't they just disconnect?
Yeah. Historically, a migrant might receive a letter every 3 months, or maybe an expensive phone call twice a year. Why can't they just distance themselves while they get on their feet?
And that question leads us directly to the profound modern exacerbator of this entire crisis. The reason the pressure is inescapable is sitting right in their pocket.
Smartphone.
We are entering the realm of what sociologists term dual presence, the intersection of deep trauma and modern digital communication.
Dual presence, meaning your body is in one location, but your consciousness is essentially trapped in another.
It's a fractured reality. Let's look at the physical reality first. The youth is physically located in a low-income apartment in a Western city. It's quiet, it might be cold. They are safe from kinetic violence.
Right, physically safe.
But their digital reality, the world they access every time they look down at their screen, is entirely different. through WhatsApp, Facebook, and other platforms, they are essentially still living inside the ongoing crisis back home.
The paper specifically mentions the types of communication they are receiving. It's not just, hello, how are you? They are getting real-time graphic updates of suffering.
Miserable stuff.
Yeah. They are receiving hysterical voice notes from crying relatives. They are getting deeply manipulative, guilt-inducing messages about the money they owe, or photos of family members who are still trapped in danger zones.
And because of this continuous digital tether, the author argues that they never actually arrive in safety.
They're stuck.
The host country's physical safety is rendered entirely irrelevant because their brain remains permanently locked in the red zone. Their sympathetic nervous system is still firing fight-or-flight signals because the threat is literally right there in their ear.
Jonathan Haidt's research is brought into the text here, specifically his recent work on how smartphones have rewired human psychology, right? The anxious generation.
Yes.
But applying Haidt's work to a refugee crisis is a fascinating leap.
It's a brilliant application by Dr. Gebre, honestly. Haidt argues that true, lasting trauma healing requires embodied safety. It requires physical cues.
Like what?
Well, your body needs to feel a hug. It needs to partake in communal eating. It needs to make sustained eye contact with a trusted person to truly recognize that the threat has passed.
But the refugee experience we're talking about is now basically phone-based.
Yes. They retreat into these glowing rectangles, seeking connection to their origins, but the device just delivers trauma. Furthermore, the algorithms are merciless.
Oh, right. The social media feed.
They don't just show the crying relatives. They intersperse those messages with highly curated, heavily filtered images of other successful refugees who seem to be thriving, buying cars, and sending money home.
Which artificially widens the gap between the youth's isolated, impoverished reality and the expectations of success.
It pours gasoline on the fire of perceived burdensomeness. And there is a biological consequence to this digital tether, specifically regarding time zones.
I'm glad you brought that up. The slide deck has this very moody, almost haunting illustration of a young person sitting alone in a dark bedroom, illuminated only by the harsh blue light of their phone.
It's a powerful image.
And the text connects this image directly to geography. East Africa is anywhere from 6 to 10 hours ahead of North America.
So to communicate with their families in real time, to negotiate these debts or listen to these voice notes, these youths are staying awake all night. They are living a completely nocturnal existence.
And from a neurological standpoint, staying awake all night, bathed in the cortisol-spiking blue light of a screen while listening to traumatizing audio messages, I mean, that is a recipe for total biological collapse.
It utterly destroys your circadian rhythms.
And when your circadian rhythm shatters, your emotional regulation, your impulse control, it all goes down with it.
So to the listener, imagine your body is sitting in a safe harbor, but your brain is permanently tethered to a sinking ship via Wi-Fi.
Wow.
You are watching the ship go down. You are hearing the screams of the passengers in high-definition audio directly in your ear 24 hours a day. Your nervous system doesn't know you're in a safe harbor. It thinks you are still drowning. You never actually arrive in safety.
That is horrifying. The very technology that was marketed to us as the ultimate tool for connection is the exact mechanism preventing these survivors from healing.
It's keeping them trapped.
So we've diagnosed a seemingly insurmountable systemic collapse. We have a destruction of cultural norms, a journey that violently suppresses the fear of death, host countries that foster total isolation, and a digital device that delivers crushing guilt directly to the amygdala 24/7.
It sounds totally hopeless.
What could possibly act as an antidote to a crisis this complex and tech-fueled?
This is where the source material takes a genuinely surprising pivot. Dr. Gebre doesn't propose a new pharmaceutical intervention, and he doesn't just call for increased funding to psychiatric wards.
Okay.
He proposes an ancient philosophical concept, but he reframes it as a hard biological medical intervention. He proposes kindness.
Okay, I have to stop you there.
I knew you would.
Because I can hear the listener's skepticism, and frankly, I share it. Kindness. It sounds incredibly naive. You just explained how someone survives a torture camp. Their brain is fundamentally rewired to not fear death. They are pushed into a state of total sociological anomie. And the medical intervention we are pitching is a greeting card sentiment. Just be kind.
The skepticism is totally valid, and the author anticipates it perfectly.
Yeah.
He is explicitly clear that we must violently divorce the concept of kindness from its modern superficial reputation.
So not just smiling and saying please?
No, this isn't about being polite. He frames kindness through the lens of evolutionary biology and classical philosophy as a form of structural load-bearing repair.
Load-bearing repair. I like that phrasing. How does he justify it historically?
He brings in the Stoics thinkers like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. The Stoics didn't view kindness as a soft emotion. They viewed humans as fundamentally biologically engineered for cooperation.
Like bees in a hive.
Exactly. Marcus Aurelius famously wrote that we are meant to work together like feet, hands, and eyelids.
Meaning it's not a moral bonus, it's a functional requirement. If my left hand decides to stop cooperating with my right hand, the organism fails.
Exactly. To the Stoics, philanthropia, which translates to love of humanity or kindness, was a rational duty. Acting against one another or isolating oneself is a violation of human nature that leads directly to madness. The paper also brings in the Epicureans.
Now, Epicureans usually get a bad rap for just being hedonists, focused only on pleasure.
True, but their definition of pleasure was highly specific. They believed the ultimate goal of life was ataraxia.
Ataraxia? What does that mean?
It means complete freedom from fear and anxiety. And they understood, thousands of years before modern psychology, that friendship and kindness are absolute prerequisites for ataraxia.
You can't be at peace if you're alone.
Right. You cannot achieve mental health in a vacuum. Without the security of benevolent, reciprocal relationships, the human mind inevitably collapses into paranoia.
Okay, so the ancients viewed it as structural. But how does a paper connect a 2,000-year-old philosophy to modern neurology?
By looking at the hormonal response, the author cites Rajay Essay's work, situating kindness as a dynamic force that physically alters both the giver and the receiver. He then brings in social psychologist Sonja Lyubomirsky.
What did she find?
She has extensively documented how deliberate acts of kindness are potent psychological interventions. Why? Because they trigger the release of oxytocin.
Oxytocin. We usually hear about that in the context of mothers bonding with infants or romantic partners. It's the bonding hormone.
Yes, and crucially, it's the biological antagonist to cortisol, the stress hormone.
Oh, that makes sense.
When the traditional cage of norms collapsed, the community sense of reciprocal obligation disappeared. The trust was gone.
Right?
When an act of kindness occurs in the diaspora, for example, an established member offering mentorship to a new arrival without expecting anything in return, or just helping them navigate the subway system, it does two critical things simultaneously.
Which are?
Sociologically, it disrupts that fatal trajectory of thwarted belongingness. Biologically, it spikes oxytocin in both individuals, which actively suppresses the brain's fear centers and rebuilds trust.
So what does this all mean? Let me break it down. Kindness here isn't a greeting card, it's structural repair. It's the literal mortar used to rebuild the cage of norms brick by brick.
I love that analogy.
It is the literal action that binds the isolated atom back into the molecule.
A perfect synthesis. Reestablishing a culture of reciprocal care mitigates the impulse for violence because it gives the individual a renewed sense of communal value.
That's powerful outward action.
But the author goes a step further. It's not just about outward kindness toward others. It is equally about internal kindness.
Internal kindness? You mean how they treat themselves?
Yes. The author introduces Dr. Kristin Neff's concept of self-compassion. Remember that lethal internal critic we discussed, the voice driven by perceived burdensomeness.
Right, the voice telling them they are failures because they can't pay back the ransom debt.
The voice telling them their death is worth more than their life. Dr. Ness defines self-compassion as treating oneself with the exact same warmth, understanding, and forgiveness one would offer a beloved friend in a moment of suffering.
That is so hard to do.
It is. It involves recognizing that suffering is a part of the common human experience, not an isolated personal failing. For these traumatized youth, self-compassion is not a luxury. It is framed as biological triage.
So if a young man sitting in that isolated apartment can learn to extend grace to himself, if he can somehow rewire his internal monologue to say, wait, my struggle to pay rent isn't a personal moral failure.
Right.
It is the logical result of escaping a dictatorship, navigating a brutal global economy, and surviving profound trauma. He effectively neutralizes that internal critic.
He stops the perceived burdensomeness right at the source. The research cited suggests that individuals who practice self-compassion are dramatically less likely to harbor suicidal ideation.
Wow.
And importantly, they're less likely to project their frustration outward as aggression against intimate partners. So teaching self-kindness is presented as a direct empirical intervention against both suicide and domestic homicide.
Okay, The philosophy is elegant and the biology makes perfect sense, but the listener and I are probably sharing the same thought right now. Philosophy is great in a vacuum, but how do we turn kindness into actionable policy for a community in crisis? How do you deploy oxytocin at scale?
This is where the rubber meets the road. The final section of our deep dive focuses on the author's strategic recommendations. Dr. Gebre outlines a 4-phase operational blueprint to actually inject this kindness into the community architecture.
Let's walk through these 4 phases. Phase 1 is titled Breaking Burdensomeness.
Yes.
It directly targets the family pressure and the financial debt, but how do you stop a dynamic that spans continents?
You have to break the informational asymmetry. Phase 1 calls for Diaspora leadership to launch a massive, targeted public education campaign directed squarely at the families back in the Horn of Africa, utilizing satellite television and radio broadcasts.
And the message isn't subtle either. The paper says the core message must be pressure kills.
Exactly. They need to explicitly communicate that the migration journey is not a winning lottery ticket. The message is, give your children time to stand before asking them to carry you.
It's about forcefully educating the parents on the economic realities of the West so they stop demanding the impossible.
But it is a two-front war. You can't just talk to the parents. You have to equip the youth. Simultaneously, host country agencies need to provide these refugees with aggressive financial literacy that heavily emphasizes assertiveness training.
Wait, assertiveness training? You mean teaching a deeply traumatized, culturally obedient 20-year-old how to say no to their own parents?
Exactly. Teaching them how to refuse sending remittances they cannot afford is framed here as a frontline suicide prevention strategy.
That is heavy.
They must be taught that it is biologically and financially necessary to secure their own oxygen mask first, before assisting others.
That is a brutal but completely necessary boundary to set.
It is.
Moving to phase 2, operationalizing kindness. This phase introduces a fascinating psychological framework called the helper therapy principle.
Formulated by Frank Reisman in the 1960s. The helper therapy principle suggests a counterintuitive approach to healing. It argues that individuals struggling with trauma or addiction help themselves the most when they are placed in a position to help someone else.
So instead of treating these traumatized youths solely as patients who need to sit and receive constant therapy, which, might just reinforce their feeling of being broken, you flip the dynamic entirely.
You put them to work. The strategy recommends actively enlisting these struggling young people to perform acts of service within their new community.
Like what?
Having them tutor younger children, assist the elderly with groceries, or just help newer arrivals navigate the transit system.
If we connect this back to Thomas Joiner's theory, this is a surgical strike against perceived burdensomeness.
Exactly.
Because if I am tutoring a child or carrying groceries for an elder, I am empirically no longer a burden. I have instantly transformed my identity from helpless victim to valuable contributor.
It provides immediate, undeniable proof of their own worth to the tribe, entirely independent of their financial capacity. It proves they matter today.
That is brilliant. Phase 3 is about restoring belonging, specifically by creating what the author calls third spaces.
Relying again on Jonathan Haidt's emphasis on embodied connection, the author insists that these third spaces, whether they are traditional coffee ceremonies, local sports leagues, or cultural association meetings, they must be absolute phone-free zones.
Right, because as we established, oxytocin is a physical hormone. It is not released through an algorithm or a screen. You need physical proximity. You need eye contact.
Physical presence is a non-negotiable biological requirement for healing this specific type of trauma. Furthermore, the paper recommends a massive shift in how resettlement agencies operate.
How so?
Instead of taking new arrivals and isolating them in scattered individual apartments across a city, agencies should adopt a cohort model.
Meaning you intentionally group them together.
Yes. You cluster young refugees in the same neighborhoods or housing complexes. You deliberately recreate the team dynamic, the collective reliance that allowed them to survive the desert in the first place. You rebuild the magnetic field.
I really want to highlight the conceptual risk assessment chart from the slide deck here because it puts terrifyingly stark numbers to this idea of social integration.
It's a sobering chart.
According to this chart, a youth who is completely isolated, living in that state of physical and cultural anomie, faces an 85% risk of lethal outcomes. 85%.
It is effectively a death sentence of isolation.
Now, if that youth shifts to having a digital presence, meaning They are physically isolated in their apartment, but they are highly connected to home via their smartphone. The risk drops, but only marginally to 60%.
The digital connection barely moves the needle on survival.
But look at the final metric. If that youth is integrated into an embodied community, a physical space with phone-free connection, the risk plummets to 25%.
That single chart validates the entire thesis of the paper, honestly. An embodied community built on the deliberate practice of reciprocal kindness and shared physical space is the only mathematically effective safety net.
Which brings us to the final recommendation, Phase 4, Trauma-Informed Integration. The author leans on John Hendon's solution-focused approach here.
Hendon's methodology is a real departure from traditional psychoanalysis. Instead of endlessly dwelling on the pathology of the trauma, making the victim recount the horrors of the Sinai over and over, it focuses relentlessly on what works and future possibilities.
The guiding mantra is purpose over pathology.
Exactly.
We know from our discussion of the acquired capability that feeling ineffective or passive increases the risk of violence. So Phase 4 involves engaging these survivors in future-oriented tasks, mentoring, or even physical labor projects where they can see the tangible results of their actions.
And there's one final radical recommendation in this phase that ties everything together. Digital detox retreats.
Just completely unplugging.
Deliberately taking these youths completely offline for extended immersive periods. It forces the brain to exit the state of dual presence.
Wow.
By severing the digital connection, you finally force the nervous system to acknowledge the physical reality of safety in the new country. You physically cut the Wi-Fi tether to the sinking ship, forcing the brain to realize it is standing on dry land.
Early in our source stack, there is a short video excerpt. It's brief, but it features a young voice saying, "We left everything behind, crossing the desert and the sea, searching for safety, but wherever we go, our community endures."
It's such a powerful quote.
When I first watched that, I thought it was just a beautiful poetic testament to the human spirit. But after meticulously unpacking this paper, I realized it's not poetry at all.
No, it is a biological imperative. The endurance of the community is the literal scientific cure for the trauma they have endured.
We have covered immense heavy ground today. Let's synthesize the journey of this deep dive. The crisis in the Eritrean diaspora shows us that violence and self-harm are not inherent traits of a people. They are the tragic, predictable symptoms of system overload.
Right.
When a dictatorial regime spends decades systematically shattering a society's cage of norms and harrowing migration journeys violently strip away the biological fear of death, the resulting trauma cannot be cured by physical safety alone.
Especially when smartphones keep victims tethered to the crisis they fled.
Exactly. The only true safety net is the deliberate physical and philosophical practice of kindness and embodied connection. Through self-compassion, helper therapy, and fiercely protected phone-free physical community, the cage of norms can be reconstructed.
This analysis, however, leaves us with a final provocative thought. Something for everyone to mull over.
What's that?
Well, we've explored how dual presence and digital living uniquely traumatize and isolate refugees who have lost their cage of norms. But it forces you to look at your own life.
Oh.
If the human brain absolutely requires physical, phone-free third spaces to release oxytocin, to build trust, and to maintain a will to live, are the hyper-digital, increasingly isolated routines of modern global society slowly dismantling everyone's cage of norms?
That is a chilling thought. We might not be fleeing a desert, but we are all navigating a world that increasingly replaces physical community with digital presence.
Exactly. How strong is your safety net?
A profound and necessary question to leave on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.